Did I click that? I did. Okay. Formal and official good evening to everyone. We've had an opening word of prayer, and we're going to go ahead and get started in our study. We are picking back up in the midst of the second speech cycle. As you know, Job is comprised mainly of three speech cycles between Job and his friends. The cycle consists, as we've said, of when Eliphaz begins to speak. But really, Job's the one who got the ball rolling back in chapter 3. But we've been following the friend speaking and then Job's response, the friend speaking, Job's response. And we'll continue with that through this second cycle. The third cycle will get a little bit different, as we're going to point out later. And then, of course, we have yet more difference if we get there, and I hope we will, to talk about Elihu, and then talk, of course, about God when he speaks. But we left off with the kind of third important chapter, really, in terms of Job taking steps. He has gotten to the point in chapter 16 where he is seeking a witness in heaven. So again, chapter 9, if only there were a mediator. Chapter 13, the committing to trust in God. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Chapter 16, if only there were a witness in heaven. And, depending upon translation, could possibly be a stronger statement than that. But, it's kind of like a lament of what's not there, a placing in a trust in God, a determination through reasoning what is necessary in order for faith to be rewarded, and then ultimately through faith embracing the solution, as we're going to see. But we haven't got there yet. So continue in chapter 17 now, and don't think we talked about that at all. So let me pull open my Bible here again. So in Job 17, after these little kind of peaks in faith, Job tends to bounce back down on that trampoline that we've been talking about. First 5 verses, he laments that he has no companion. Are not mockers with me, he says in verse number 2. Are we talking about the friends there? Well, it seems like, what they could be said to be doing is sort of mocking Job, not really responding to what he's saying, and, coming to him with preconceived ideas. And so, no one is willing to enter into any kind of agreement with Job. They all see Job as being inferior. When he talks about no one shaking hands with me in verse 3, that's the way that they, and you can see that through parallelism, that's the way they form pledges. But no one is treating Job as an equal, effectively. So no companions, no one is with me. And he describes his condition. Every time we get these little insights into what he's going through, he, that is God, has made me a byword of the people, and I have become one in whose face men spit. Can you imagine that? There are places, no doubt, where that still happens today, but it's so far removed from our experience. The idea that you would see someone in great turmoil and then walk up to them and spit in their face. And, that's what the people are doing here to Job. And that's how deeply embedded this sort of false theology is amongst the people in Job's day. Job is suffering because he is a sinner, and in their eyes at least, and so they feel justified in coming up to him and spitting in his face. He views himself as having hope only in the grave, but not from the standpoint of resurrection at this point. He's talking about the grave as though the worm is going to be corruption is going to be his father. In other words, decay. When the prophecy in the Psalm about Jesus, that the Holy One wouldn't see corruption, that's decay. And so decay is going to be his father. The worm is going to be his mother and his sister. And so he's going to have companions there in the grave of, just being able to finally be free of his pain. And so there's no real hope there in those statements. So Bildad responds for the second time with rebuke of what he has seen in Job, and then also a reinforcement of what he has previously said. First 4 verses, we see this This rebuke, how long till you put an end to words? Gain understanding, afterward will speak. So they think he doesn't know anything, and yet they view themselves as being the ones counted as beasts in verse 3 and regarded stupid in your sight. So you tear yourself in anger. You're speaking in anger, Job. This is emotional nonsense, is effectively what they're saying to him. I believe the modern terminology for that would be that they are gaslighting Job, and just acting as though his complaints are not valid or justified in any way. Bildad repeats and then reinforces Eliphaz's statements. As you read chapter 18 and verses 5 through 21, he is reinforcing not only what he said, but it's kind of repeating what Eliphaz said. You're going to find a lot of similarity between chapter 18, 5 through 21, and 15, 20 through 25. And so already, again, you're seeing the friends not really engaging the moment, not really working through with wisdom or logic what's happening, and sort of turning a deaf ear to Job, which no doubt would have been incredibly frustrating. But for the sake of that, frustrating experience, again, we're given the opportunity for Job to bounce off of these ideas, and so we come to the sixth speech, and this is the climax of Job's faith. Sadly, while depression seems to lessen as the chapters continue, to a degree. I mean, you could argue that when he talks about his condition later in the end of the third cycle, that maybe that's, those are statements made in depression, or maybe it's just a part of the case that he's building, as we'll talk about in a minute. But really, the most powerful statements that you're going to find in the book of Job in terms of faith are here in chapter 19, and in specific at the close of chapter 19, because as it opens up, we have these kind of typical responses. Job's frustrated with his friend's condemnation. And in the midst of all of that, there's still, we're getting little hints as to what it is that Job is going to need to repent of later. You see verse 6, for example, know then that God has wronged me. Wow, that's a powerful statement to make. And so we're going to have that substantiated. How has God wronged Job? Well, by virtue of him not deserving what he has been experiencing, as we're going to see, he's going to say that. But again, he's frustrated at their condemnation, frustrated, obviously, because, oh, by the way, let me say this really quickly about verse 3, these 10 times you have reproached me. You might say, well, counting up the friend's speeches, we haven't had 10 speeches. It must be, somewhat of a colloquial kind of saying. We see throughout Hebrew literature kind of, numbers being used sort of figuratively, so here, I think 10 just kind of as a big number, like you've done this 10 times, kind of thing. And so just over and over again is kind of the idea there. But he's frustrated with what he feels is God's treatment of him as we continue. There is no justice, as we saw in verse 7. He, God, has fenced up my way so that I cannot pass. He has set darkness in my paths. He has stripped me of my glory, taken the crown off my head. So again, all of these things are attributed to God. And this is why it is that God, in his eyes, has wronged him. So he's frustrated with what God has done. He's also frustrated with all of these other afflictions that he's been facing. And again, another insight into the sufferings of Job. Verse 14, relatives have failed, close friends have forgotten him. Those who dwell in my house and my maidservants count me as a stranger. Remember, a few of the servants of Job survived all of this. And so these people who would have worked with Job day in and day out are now also shunning Job, and so either he is ill-treated or he is not treated by those around him. Shunning, of course, is a part of the church's response to sin. Talks about that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. But they're doing it to Job here. I call my servant, he gives no answer. Verse 16. Verse 17, this is very powerful. My breath is offensive to my wife. And when he says I'm repulsive to the children of my own body, I think that there must be some kind of a translation issue there. And so don't read into that his children are still alive. But that again, that there is there are people who are close to Job that are alienating Job, and young children are despising him. Verse 18, close friends are abhorring him, and his bone clings to skin and to his flesh. You need to wrap your mind around these pictures, because again, as vivid as the pictures in chapter 1 and 2 are, they are incomplete. And I don't have I've deleted my key slide there. That's not good. Well, I'm sorry about that. And let me back out and see if I maybe just change the location of it. No, it is not there. So we'll move forward here and note that in verses in the verses that follow, you have this kind of interesting and ironic lament of Job in verses 23 and 24. Oh, that my words were written. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book, that they were engraved on a rock with an iron pen and lead forever. He says something significant happening here, and I wish that someone would know about it. Now, he doesn't think that's going to happen, but there is something that he does think is going to happen. And this is where, again, we see faith sort of coming back into the picture and climaxing. And so let's talk about these very important verses here, beginning in verse number 25. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand at last on the earth. And after my skin is destroyed, this I know, that in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. How my heart yearns within me. So what a powerful statement to make. And now I will say that there are some differences in translation with this reading, but it's even with the differences in translation, I've not discovered any way to kind of just totally remove the idea of what Job's saying here. And so there's now an acknowledgement where previously there'd only been a hope of there being a redeemer, of there being someone who was effectively going to step in and do what Job wished would happen at the close, or rather what he was lamenting not happening back in chapter 9, and kind of what he wished would happen in chapter 16. And really, isn't that the nature of faith? The nature of faith is that when we truly embrace the realities of God, we will see as being just as real as anything else, anything that is required for those realities to take place. I really love, you read through the book of Genesis, there's a lot that you can say about the patriarchs and their failures, but I really love the way that they thought about God's promises. You take, for example, Isaac, and he's going to pass this blessing. One of his failures is obviously that he's going to pass it along to Esau, and he hasn't really consulted his wife, and so she's upset about that, and he hasn't really not much of anything reserved by way of blessing for Jacob. But of course the trickery happens. He gives the blessing to Jacob, and then when Isaac comes in, if you're reading that from the standpoint of just maybe a first-time reader of the Bible, you read through that and you're like, that's just words, like why can't he say the same thing to Isaac, or why can't he, just say, oh, I made a mistake and let me now say this to you, why is he kind of acting like I've got nothing left for you? Well, it's because the blessings of God, even the blessings which were prospective and promised, were tangible items to the to the patriarchs. I don't mean like tangible in the sense of like taste, touch, and see and smell and that kind of thing, but they were as real as anything else, is what I'm trying to say. So Isaac gives the blessing to Esau. There's nothing left. I mean, to Jacob, rather, excuse me. And there's nothing left for Esau. There's no further blessing. And he's like, you can even see him as he's talking to Esau. He's like scrounging around for words. What didn't I say to Jacob? What didn't I offer him? So again, that's what faith was to the patriarchs, and you could equally say that's what it should be for us as well. So I really appreciate what we see in Job in these verses. And yet, for that wonderful little pinnacle of faith, he closes out the chapter, and his friends miss it because he says something that they seem to have taken offense at. So he closes out with returning to a statement, to the friends. If you should say, how shall we persecute him, since the root of the matter is found in me? Be afraid of the sword for yourselves, for wrath brings the punishment of the sword, that you may know there is a judgment. And so basically, I'm going to be proven to be right. I'm going to be redeemed, and you're going to be proven to be wrong. And so they don't hear any of the redemption part effectively, and they only hear you're going to be proven to be wrong. And they don't like that, as we're going to see when we get into Zophar's speech. But what questions do we have over chapter 19 and that pinnacle of faith that we see there in verses 25 through 27? All right, well, feel free to bring something up later, but for the sake of time, we're going to go ahead and keep moving forward. Chapter 20 now, Zophar's final speech. We get another angry response. We've kind of characterized Zophar as a bit of a hothead, and he certainly is. In his response, we see that he's anxious. Verse 2, there's turmoil within him. I've heard the rebuke that reproaches me. The spirit of my understanding causes me to answer. And so, again, I know more than you, and you think you can get away with rebuking me. You can't. The response is interesting, actually, because there's a little bit of a concession now. So wicked men, they triumph. Previously they've been saying they don't effectively, but now they say they triumph, but only briefly. And there's even a bigger concession here in the midst of all of this. And verse 8, he will fly away like a dream and not be found. So this is the wicked person dying. But then you get to verse 10, his children will seek the favor of the poor, and his hands will restore his wealth. And so the children are still around, whereas back in chapter 15 and verse 34, the company of the hypocrites will be barren, and fire will consume the tents of bribery. And so they're not supposed to survive, the children of the wicked. But no, now there's a little bit of a concession again, although you're not going to see them acknowledge that. Wickedness is first sweet and then bitter, as he says in verses 12 through 19. And so, you take evil in and it's sweet in your mouth, but then it's ultimately something that's like poison, in verse 16, like the poison of snakes. So in verse 20, I've got a little bit of problem with the slides there, and I guess that's what happened. I might have deleted one and put it over. But anyway, sorry about that. In verses 20 through 29, the wicked will be hunted down and destroyed. And so just not much more that we can draw out of this. It's kind of really more of the same. So in the seventh speech, after this sort of pinnacle of faith, we now see a response to the friends, and what's going to ultimately kick off sort of a new cycle of things happening. So once again, we see the opening kind of address. He's asking for them to listen carefully to my speech, and let this be your consolation. You will find needed teaching and encouragement, comfort in these words if you'll just listen. And so you can speak, and then after that you can keep mocking. So we have confirmation that he's viewing them as the sort of the mockers there in verse number 3. But verses 7 through 16, here's the thing that they're not realizing, and that now Job is embracing: the fact that the wicked can prosper and even die in peace, as he says. And so, and even going on to describe how their livestock, doesn't have any issue, increasing or multiplying. Verse 10, they, have children, and their children are joyful. Verses 11 and 12, and they spend their days in wealth. Verse 13, and then they go to the grave, and that's it. So their prosperity is in their hand. Verse 16, various translations of that. But whatever, however you look at it, there's a contrast there between that and where he sees himself in the second part of verse 16. The counsel of the wicked is far from me. And so I'm not saying this is good. I'm just saying that this is what is. So he challenges on this basis the claims of the friends in verses 17 through 26, and just asks them, how often what they say happens, how often it really does play out. How often is the lamp of the wicked put out, verse 17? How often does their destruction come upon them? So you say all of this happens, but how often does it really happen? So is it really as cut and dry as you are making it seem to be? He identifies with the position to a degree, but just wants to challenge them. I know your thoughts, verse 27, and the schemes with which you would wrong me, but and I get where you're coming from, but have you really thought about the exceptions to your words? And so again, there's a close where we've got some strong words to the friends. Verse 34, how then can you comfort me with empty words, since falsehood remains in your answers? And so truth bomb dropped, and that's the end of Job's 7th speech. So now we get second cycle beginning, a third cycle, sorry, in chapters 22 through 31. So let's talk about what characterizes this third and this final cycle, and contrast it with the previous three. So in the first cycle, we see Job in anguish, and we see the friends begging for repentance based on mercy and goodness. They have characterized Job as being in sin, but they are not trying to appeal to him on the basis of fear. Primarily, they're trying to primarily, appeal to them on the basis of God's goodness. Cycle 2, Job's faith grows, as we've seen, and while he takes steps forward, the friends focus, instead of the goodness and mercy of God, they focus on the evil that comes to the wicked, and kind of get stuck in that rut, really, in that second cycle. We get into cycle 3. We now have direct speech. Kind of Job is always the one who kind of like kicks this off and starts us in a new way of kind of cycling here. And so he's talked directly at the friends in chapter 21, and now we're going to see the friends kind of responding in kind, direct speech between the friends until they ultimately give up. We see Eliphaz speak. We see Bildad speak, but Zophar doesn't say anything. Maybe he's just so furious at this point that he's just past it. But when the friends stop speaking, that leaves Job to kind of kick into high gear, developing this idea of a complaint against God and also his defense before God, because one of the things that he has more or less argued for is or desired to have is a kind of a court case day. I want to go into court, and I want to be able to have a hearing here between me and God, and the arguments will build to a kind of an exclamation point at the close of chapter 31, after he defends himself vigorously with effectively saying that again, God is wrong. He said that in chapter 19. He's going to kind of say that again as we move forward. Let's jump into the final speech of Eliphaz in chapter 22. Whereas before, the friends have been very generic in what they've said. They and Job all the time has been saying, tell me what the problem is. Tell me how I've sinned. Be specific. So Eliphaz says, okay, you want specific charges? And effectively what he does is he makes up stuff. And we know it's not true because he's insinuating that these things have happened before. Job has suffered, and Job certainly couldn't have done it after he began suffering. And so these are things that he did, and then that brought about his suffering. We know that's not the case from the way that the book begins. Job did not begin the book in sin. And in fact, even in the close of his 2 periods of testing by Satan, before the friends come, in both cases, he was found without sin. So specific charges are found there in the first 11 verses. You see him kicking back before he says that to that old Eliphaz kind of refrain. Can a man be profitable to God? Verse 2. Of course not. Men are not worth anything to God. But here's the accusations. This is pretty bad stuff. You have taken pledges from your brother with no reason. You've stripped the naked of their clothing. Wow. You have not given the weary water to drink. You have withheld bread from the hungry. The mighty man possessed the land, the honorable man dwelt in it, but you have sent widows away empty. So verse 8 is probably him saying, how Job, this is how you saw yourself, Job. You were a big prideful man, and in the meanwhile, you were robbing people left and right. You sent the widows away empty, and the strength of the fatherless was crushed. Whenever orphans got a scrap of bread, you slapped it out of their hand, kind of thing. And so fatherless don't have much strength, in other words. And so he took what little they had away from them. And so there we go. And so where did he get all that from?
It's a pretty sad print.
Yeah, from nowhere. He just made it up. Yeah, I mean, just a shot in the dark.
Makes you wonder why Eliphaz wanted to be Job's friend in the first place if he knew all these horrible things about him.
Yeah, exactly. So Job if it been today, maybe Job would have broken in and said, well, what does that say about you that you're here, my friend, kind of thing. So yeah. Well, on that basis, of course, Job said, he says to Job, think about what your position is. Think about God, who is greater than you, as verse 12 kind of begins here. Think about where you sit in the scheme of things, and where you could sit if you would just turn to God. He fills their houses with good things, the people who follow God. And then he also claims but the counsel of the wicked is far from me in verse 18. That's interesting. Now we've got some again contrasting views of the way that God sees here in looking at Eliphaz and Job. So verse 12, is not God in the height of the heaven, and see the highest stars, how lofty they are? And you say, what does God know? Can he judge me through the deep darkness? Thick clouds cover him so that he cannot see, and he walks above the circle of the heavens. So that's what he says Job is saying. That is what Job is saying, but go back to chapter 7 and verse 19. How long will you not look away from me? And well, actually, let me say that differently. He thinks that Job is saying that God can't see him, and Job is really saying that he's actually focusing too much on me. Chapter 9 and verse 11. If he goes by me, I do not see him. He moves past, I do not perceive him. And so there's sort of this, he's looking at me only to curse me, and he doesn't see me for who I am. And so you kind of have the omniscient God with Eliphaz, and sort of the selective omniscience in the way that Job sees him. But then find some interesting, what could be thought of as almost plagiarism in verses 17 and 18, because, again, that statement, the counsel of the wicked is far from me, sounds very familiar. And it's basically because that's what he's just said in the previous chapter. And so, it's like listening but not listening. And I only think that must have added to the frustration that Job was experiencing. Eliphaz pleads with Job to return to God in verses 21 through 30. Acquaint yourself with him again and be at peace is the idea there in verse 21. And so just again, an appeal. I will say that in this appeal, this is probably for what's bad about Eliphaz's speech here. It's almost a preachable sermon. You could look at Eliphaz's closing words here and find what it takes to come back to God, 4 steps to return. Acquaint yourself with him, be at peace, thereby good will come to you. Receive, please, instruction from his mouth, lay up his words in your heart. Return to the Almighty, you'll be built up. You will remove iniquity far from your tents. Then you will lay your gold in the dust and the gold of Ophir among the stones of the brooks. And so 4 steps to return, and then 5 attendant blessings. Then you will have your delight in the Almighty and lift up your face to God. You will make your prayer to him. He will hear you, pay your vows. You will declare a thing, and it will be established for you. So light will shine on your ways. And when they cast you down and say exaltation will come, then he will save the humble person. He will not deliver one who is not innocent, though. And so special deliverance comes again to those who are followers of God. And so, like I said, you could almost go through that and uphold those words. Not all that the friends say is bad. In the 8th speech, we see Job now, kind of beginning to substantiate this questioning of God. It's not that this is the beginning of questioning God. It's the beginning of a substantial, kind of question towards God, and then formulating the way that he sees things working. In verse 23, verses 1 through 9, we see him believing that his complaint is fully justified. My complaint is bitter, but he says, if I could find him, verse 3, find God, then I would present, verse 4, my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would know the words which he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. Wow, that's a big claim about God, isn't it? And I think that these are some of the things that God is actually responding to. You think you have the answers. Okay, let me ask you the questions, as we're going to see later. Would he contend with me in his great power? No, he would take note of me, and so he would see that I'm right. Problem is, I just can't find him. And look, I go forward, but he's not there, and backward, but I cannot perceive him. Verse 8 and verse 9. He works on the left hand, I cannot behold him, and he turns to the right hand, I cannot see him. And so again, sort of this selective omniscience. He doesn't understand why God is acting this way, when he, and yet, even though he sees to some degree purpose in his trials, and maybe you could argue that there's a little return to faithfulness in chapter 23 and verse 10. He knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I shall come forth as gold. So he says, I kind of get what's happening here, but at the same time, there's this realization that kind of dawns on him. He says, verse 13, he is unique. Who can make him change? Whatever his soul desires, that he does. So let's think about kind of what he's saying up until this point. Effectively, he says, I just know that if we could get together on this, it would work out, right? But then he says, in the course of starting to see a bit of the purpose of what God is doing here, he says, God can do whatever he wants. Now, wait, if God can do whatever he wants, then why isn't he coming to me? Why isn't he talking to me? Why isn't he examining my case as I know he should? Well, he must not want to serve to have me as a servant. He must want to truly persecute me and harm me and hurt me. And that's why that kind of realization kind of cuts off what could have been a very beautiful sentiment arising there in chapter 23 and verse 10. And it turns from that beautiful sentiment to verse 15. Therefore, I'm terrified at his presence. When I consider this, I am made afraid of him. God made my heart weak, and the Almighty terrifies me, because I was not cut off from the presence of his darkness, and he did not hide deep darkness from my face. And so, again, whatever he might mean specifically by that, he wasn't kept from all these things happening to me. Therefore, this must be what God wants to be doing to me. And that kind of turn ends sort of the more climactic statements of Job in the text moving forward. So you just wish that that thought could have been fleshed out, chapter 23 and verse 10, a little bit more. But you can see the reasoning and certainly sympathize with it. God must want to be doing this to me, because he could be doing otherwise. That is the problem of evil in a nutshell. So instead of seeing this world as one of righteous people being rewarded and wicked people suffering, he actually sees the world as a place of injustice. And so he's kind of, again, beginning to build that case in his mind against God, and talking about people who are just mistreated, and you kind of get the picture in the reading there of kind of like maybe ancient refugees kind of thing, like a refugee camp out there in the wilderness, people having to live like wild donkeys in the desert, verse number 5. And so after that statement about the world being one of injustice, we have a series of statements that seem to be in contrast to that, although you'll notice that I've put a little asterisk there. And that's because chapter 24, verses 18 through 25, depending upon your translation, it varies widely. The Hebrew has it, the Hebrew is problematic, and the ESV's interpretation, for example, instead of making it about what Job is saying about what is ultimately coming to those who are wicked, really this is just Job summarizing what the friends are saying. Sometimes when you have these sort of difficulties in the Hebrew text, you can turn to an ancient translation of the Hebrew text. The Septuagint is one of the oldest, probably I guess it's the oldest translation of the Hebrew text, and actually predates our earliest full copy of the Hebrew text. And so go the Septuagint, but that doesn't help on this occasion, because the Septuagint actually turns this section, instead of it being anything about what is ultimately coming to those who are wicked, it turns it into a curse against the wicked. And so it takes a very even further different kind of tact than what we see our English translations reflecting primarily, at least the ones that I've checked in preparation for class here. So again, is he returning to a belief that things will be made right? Maybe not here. And although you will see that kind of statement kind of being made in his next little set of speeches. So after this speech, the last of the friends to speak, at least the last of the three friends to speak, comes forward. Bildad has his final say, and in particular responds to this request to see God in court. And very short, and you can see the friends are kind of at a loss for words at this point. Who is Job to be calling God into court? That's a big thing, and it really is. I mean, it's one thing to say, why God? It's another thing to say, that I'm going to take God to court over this. Well, who's going to be the judge in that case? Ultimately, when I feel that I can bring God into a courtroom, I've effectively made myself the judge. And there's a lot of people who do that with God. They place themselves in the judgment seat. And so, yes, the friends have not done Job any favors. Yes, in Eliphaz's speech, they've made up some things. You can see why maybe they really have not much to say in response to this. And so, Job, your request here is just impossible because God is too great. And you could argue that he's maybe right in saying that. Dominion and fear belong to him. He makes peace in his high place. Is there any number to his armies upon whom does his light not rise? So he's the great God over all. And so you're not going to get your day in court. And then on top of that, and this is where again the friend's disposition is stepping in. Your request is impossible because man is too sinful. How then can man be righteous before God? How can he be pure who is born of a woman? And so again, that sort of very negative view of man that comes out of what ultimately is a bad theology. It's interesting that the modern Calvinist effectively believes Bildad right here. How can a man be righteous before God? He was be pure, who was born of a woman. Man is a worm and a maggot. Verse number 6. And we certainly need to have humility before God. We certainly need to realize our inadequacy, our utter failure before God because of sin. But we also need to see sin as a choice and not an inborn condition. And we need to see sin also as not something that God saw as totally rendering us valueless. The Son of God did not die for worms and maggots. Think about that from time to time. He died for beings who were made in the image of God, who imperfected that image through sin, but who could and can be redeemed. And that's how Jesus sees us. So don't let Bildad or his more modern counterparts in the Calvinistic world kind of convince you of the way that you should view yourself. All right. In the ninth speech, he says, God is great, but I'm innocent. So a response to Bildad in chapter 26, bit of sarcasm here. You can hear in his tone. How have you helped him who is without power? How have you saved the arm that has no strength? How have you counseled one who has no wisdom? And how have you declared sound advice to many? So that's dripping with sarcasm, and so I know some things about God, he says as he continues here. And we see, it's kind of like, you think I don't know God, I do know God. And he talks about the greatness again of God. You see the friends kind of trying to outdo each other with these speeches about God. And so I know about God's greatness. You think I don't know that? Let me show you. But then for all of his greatness, as he says in chapter 27, he says, I'm still innocent. As God lives, who has taken away my justice. Wow. Again, some statements that Job, when you're thinking about his repentance, these are some of the things that Job has wrong. But still, not giving up on his faithfulness, not giving up on the pursuit of doing what God would have him to do. He says, as long as he lives, verse 3, verse 4, my lips will not speak wickedness, my tongue will not utter deceit. And so I'm not going to do the wrong thing. I'm going to hold to righteousness. I'm not going to let it go. My heart shall not reproach me as long as I live. And so I'm going to keep doing the right things. He sees that as being the basis of his innocence, but he still wants that court case. So Job knows that the wicked are cursed, as he says in verses 8 through 12. what is the hope of the hypocrite, though he gain much if God takes away his life? He knows the wicked are going to get what's coming to them eventually, but he talks about, we kind of come to that sort of in chapter 27, 13 to 23, what we really wanted him to say back in chapter 24, but we weren't sure if he did say. You kind of get the sense that it eventually does happen with wicked people. They eventually do get what's coming to them. So with that, having said that, he's kind of at a loss here. He does evidently sort of, you get the sense that there's a pause, but there's no response. And so, I already mentioned that, but pause, but no response. And so there's this chapter that is kind of stuck in here with the question, where is wisdom to be found? There's actually some people, I will say, about chapter 28 that see it as an interjection altogether, like maybe Job isn't even speaking here, or maybe this is the pen of inspiration that's telling the story, kind of interjecting and saying, what do we do about this? And I have no problem, though, of seeing it as a continuation of Job's speech, and Job, honestly saying, I'm at a loss to put all this together. And I know that we don't know. I know that we don't have wisdom here, but where can we find it? Man is skilled at finding treasure, as he says in verses 1 through 11. You get a greater respect for the ancients by reading some of those things that he describes here. That they were engaging in mining activity as of the time of Job. We sometimes look at these ages and we see ourselves as so much further advanced, and that's not really being very fair with reality. But anyway, man is skilled at finding treasure, but man is not really skilled at finding wisdom. Where can wisdom be found? Verses 12 through 19. They ask that question at the beginning of verse number 12. And so he knows that wisdom comes ultimately from God alone, but then the question is therefore begged, why doesn't God respond? And so that kind of paves the way for what is going to be ultimately the closing argument for Job in his case. Just pause for a second. I don't have a clock here with me. Yeah, that's about what it felt like to me. So put that back up, and good time to take a pause. And before we get the final sort of speech, defense of Job from Job, and one of the most lengthy discussions of his suffering, we'll take a pause about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and do that. So before we do that, any questions up until this point, up until chapter 28?
It'd be very easy for someone to question themselves, and then like doubt their own reasoning. That they were innocent, but they, you hear of court cases they're pressured into confessing, and they're actually innocent. So Job, it's interesting. Job, it's kind of that process. He's working it out. So, but he remains. Yeah, he doesn't doubt his innocence. So,
yeah. The wrong turn for Job, and this is something that we can take already as a lesson in all of this, is not in what he does, but you have to ask yourself at times, am I pursuing righteousness or am I pursuing God? In the course of pursuing God, I will, if I love God, keep his commandments. I will do what he asks. But if in the course of pursuing, God, I start to embrace righteousness, that's where Satan can step in and at times call me to do as Job and actually question God, because I can start to see in my righteousness what instead of what should be good and healthy, it can sort of become a sort of self-righteousness. And so that really is what ultimately is going to happen with Job. He's already said little things here and there. But you're right. I mean, it does say a lot about Job and who he is, that even when pressured, you don't see him confessing to things he hasn't done. So he's a strong character. But still, with each person, for their strengths or their weaknesses, there's always a temptation, and that I guess would have been Job's. So we have to be careful that our righteousness does not turn into a sort of self-righteousness. Yeah. Thanks for mentioning that. Okay. Well, let's pause our recording. Okay, welcome back officially, and picking back up in chapter 29 now. And so Job has asked the question, perhaps, or we'll leave room for the possibility for that to be some kind of interjection, as some people have thought about chapter 28. Where is wisdom to be found? Well, at the very least, Job's argument is that God's not saying anything, even though wisdom might come from him. And so Job proceeds with his case. And so what is his case? Well, effectively, 3 chapters and by the way, it says in chapter 29, verse 1, Job further continued his discourse. That's kind of the indication that the friends aren't saying anything, regardless of whether he stopped speaking in chapter 27 or chapter 28. They're not saying anything. And so his overview consists of basically chapter 29 and 30, why his suffering is too great, and description of his suffering, unlike what we've seen before. We have gotten glimpses here and there. This is a very detailed discussion of what he is enduring. And then in chapter 31, a description of Job as a righteous man. We'll talk about the significance of that text when we get there. But God, as he talks about his past, God was near him and his family. Oh, that I were as in months past, as in days when God watched over me. And so again, that selective omniscience that Job seems to have, in his view of God. And so this poetic picture of what it was like. For some reason, sometimes we say things, when we say things are easy, we talk about them being like a cakewalk or something. I don't know all the ins and outs of that expression and where that came from. But I guess the ancient equivalent would be in verse 6, when my steps were bathed with cream and the rocks poured out rivers of oil for me. And so I didn't even have to, worry about dashing my foot against a stone. That sounds familiar to anybody. The prophecy about Jesus was descriptive in that way, but in Job's steps, there's cream or there's oil, and so his path is paved with ease. He's respected by all people, and so where does he sit in society? This makes Eliphaz's claims, by the way, all the more ridiculous. When you think about him having said what he did and making up those charges. I mean, this is how he was, and when we have no reason to doubt what Job is saying here, because again, chapter 1 described Job as the greatest man in all the East. He was highly regarded, and what did that mean? It meant that when he goes into the open square, verse 7, the young men saw him and hid, and so they're embarrassed to even be near him. The aged men arose and stood, and so. You stand up as a sign of respect. That still happens today. I don't know if that's a custom everywhere, but I know that especially in the southern United States, it's very common for people to stand up to acknowledge the entrance of someone important in a room, even kind of in an informal setting. The princes refrained from talking. They put their hands in their mouth. Verse 9, verse 10, the voice of the nobles was hushed. Their tongue stuck to the roof of their mouth. So nobody had anything to say when Job was around, because they wanted to hear him and see what he had to say. The blessing of a perishing man came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. People respected me, and I was doing good for for those who needed it. Righteousness was my clothing, verse 14, which it should be. The book of Revelation, as you're getting into, Nicholas, is going to describe the saints as wearing white. Correct? They're wearing robes of white, which is the righteousness of the saints, and so it should be our clothing. But Job says that, and he talks about his hope and his happiness in that stage of his life. He said in verse 18, I'm going to die in my nest and multiply my days of the stem. I'm going to live a good, honest life, and I'm just going to see this tree, this family tree, this that I'm building is going to, or rather that I'm growing, is going to continue to grow. And he talks about his bow being renewed in his hand. I haven't talked about that. I don't think the bow being a pretty typical Old Testament symbol for strength, and so the bow renewed in my hand is, he's ever, those who wait upon the Lord will renew their strength. That's kind of the thing that he's talking about. But now, as a contrast to all of that, even the societal losers, I mean, not to put it, too bluntly, I mean, he says basically that now these people who are the sons of vile men, not even the vile men, but the sons of vile men, he says in verse 8, are now the people who make fun of Job. I'm disdained by people who are younger than me, chapter 30, verse 1, whose fathers I disdain to put with the dogs of my flock. And so not servants, not even dogs, in terms of the kind of people that are now making fun of Job. How do they treat him? In chapter 30 and verse 9. So add these things to the picture of Job's suffering. We've already seen people spitting in Job's face, but now it says I'm their taunting song. So they're coming around Job and singing songs that are insulting him. And again, just be thankful. Why don't people act this way? And the reason is that Christianity has had a big influence. And, I don't know if I can say this like universally, but there are places where Christianity has not had much of an influence. I think even you could argue that Islam is a tiny bit of Christian, and at the very least, Jewish value kind of going into the world, obviously seated in a whole lot of air. But you want a place where there's just no presence of God. We had a young man come to us at Four Seas College from mainland China, and he had been badly burned in a manufacturing incident. His parents were actually manufacturing fireworks in their house. And so again, the things that people do to try to build a life for themselves there, but they were doing that. The house burned down, both parents died, and this young man, he was badly disfigured. He was the subject of disdain, scorn, ridicule throughout his entire life living there, because the assumption was not that God was against this person, because there is no God in their society, that this person was ill-fated. He had bad luck, and because of that, he should be avoided. And so he came into the care of some Christians, thankfully, over there, and was able to get some reconstructive surgeries, and ultimately came to Four Seas College. And just he marveled all the time at how he was treated in a Christian context as compared to the way that he was treated in his home country. And so again, just be thankful, very thankful for the influence of Christianity on society. I know that comes through many filters in many places, and people don't acknowledge that influence. Today it's more common for the popular world to insult Christianity than to acknowledge its contributions. But Jesus did change the world, and he continues to do so, and we want to thank God for it. But Job is just really mistreated by those who are around him, as it says, and they're not just singing these songs, that they're actually like like knocking him down when he tries to walk places. And verse 12, at my right hand, the rabble arises. They push away my feet. They raise against me their ways of destruction. They break up my path. They promote my calamity. They have no helper. They come as broad breakers. And so no one's intervening in their behavior, in other words. And so just hounded constantly by these terrible people. His days are full of affliction, he says in verses 16 through 23. Just days of affliction is the phrase that we've borrowed from verse 16, and facing a terrible time. And in all of this, he seeks death. He just wants to die, but there's no death that comes to him. Have I not? In the midst of all of this, have I not wept for him who is in trouble? Verse 25, has not my soul grieved for the poor? But when I looked for good, evil came to me, and when I waited for light, then came darkness. And so I'm not getting help, even though I try my best to help others. And so I go about mourning. In verse 28, I'm a brother of jackals, companion of ostriches, and so kind of like Lazarus, whose friends and companions were only the dogs. Well, he's out there with the wild animals, and so he's got constant fever, verse 30, and just a really sad picture. And add all of that to your understanding of what Job is going through. Now, what follows after that case of saying no one deserves this effectively in 29 and 30. Chapter 31, here's why I really don't deserve this. Like, here's why I especially do not deserve this. And so what you find is a description of Job, Job describing his righteousness. Now, take a step back and say that this is actually good information for us, because this is Job describing what made him the man who is upheld as an example of a servant of God by God himself in the first two chapters. So I've described this text before, chapter 31, as not just an overview of Job's life, but the anatomy of a righteous man, of a blameless man. This is what a blameless man looks like according to Scripture. And so what does a blameless man look like according to Scripture? A blameless man is a man who is not lusted, and so he describes how he's not lusted. And what a powerful, you talk about Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount, talking about guarding your eyes. Here's Job, possibly 2,000 years before Jesus comes onto the scene, kind of effectively saying the same thing, espousing the same truth, and governing himself by the same kind of guideline and behavior. He says in verse 1, I've made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman? And so he made an agreement with his eyes. He said, eyes, I'm not going to let you get me in trouble. I'm not going to look upon a woman, and therefore I'm not going to lust after her. And so Job, moved his eyes away when there were enticing things that he shouldn't see. Do we do the same? We can challenge ourselves on each of these points, and I think we should. We should challenge ourselves and ask, is this the way that I govern myself? Because again, this is what a blameless man does and what he looks like. And so in verses 5 through 8, he says, I've been honest. I've walked, if I've walked with falsehood, or if my foot has hastened to deceit, let me be weighed on honest scales, that God may know my integrity. And so weigh me out. You're going to find that I've been honest. I have dealt honestly in my business endeavors, and I've said the truth. He's been faithful. He says in his marriage, my heart had been enticed by a woman, or I lurked at my neighbor's door. He says if that happened, then effectively, verse 10, even though it's to our ears a bit of a crude way of saying it, he said he'd feel comfortable about his wife cheating on him if he had done it to her, but he hasn't. And so he said that would be wickedness, verse 11. And so again, sexual purity has characterized this man, both in terms of lust and in terms of behavior. And he saw those two things as being battles that he needed to, as a man of God, win. He had been a good master in his treatment of effectively his servants, but we could say effectively his employees. What kind of leader of men has he been? He hasn't despised the cause of his male servant or his female servant when they complained against him. So and I love this affirmation of equality. And again, 2,000 years before Jesus, 4,000 years before us. In verse 15, did not he who made me in the womb make them? Did not the same one fashion us in the womb? So we are children of God in the sense of having been created by him. And so equality in creation. And far cry from the slave trade, which dominated obviously the kind of last 1,000 years of human history almost. So this wasn't a part of Job's understanding of who people were. In chapter 31, verses 16 through 23, it constantly helped the less fortunate, and so he didn't. The Lazarus is described. We mentioned him earlier, but he's described in the text there in Luke 16 as desiring the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. Job says in verse 16, to contrast that picture of him and the rich man there of Luke 16, if I have kept the poor from their desire. So if the poor wanted something from Job, Job was more than happy to share and give. If he caused the eyes of the widow to fail, the eyes failing, throughout this section of scripture and throughout the Old Testament, your eyes fail when you lose hope. So the widow never lost hope when she came to Job. She had help in Job, and so he always had a bustling dinner table. Verse 17, or eaten my morsel by myself, so that the fatherless could not eat of it. You get the picture of Job maybe in Boaz as he sort of invites Ruth to partake of food there, and looks after her. And you can see Job doing something like that with people who might have come in similar circumstances to him. I've seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or any poor man without covering. If someone came to me and his heart has not blessed me, if people haven't had a reason to be thankful because of me, and so this is, again, he's saying, if I haven't, and that means he has. This is what he's doing. And he says, if I haven't done these things, then let my arm fall from my shoulder, let my arm be torn from the socket. So I've been doing these things. He is not trusted in riches nor in idolatry. You can see the beginning of idolatry here. Obviously, the statements about riches are pretty straightforward, but in verse 26, when he says, if I observe the sun when it shines, or the moon moving in brightness, and you're like, what's the big deal with that? We'll keep reading. So that my heart has been secretly enticed, and my mouth has kissed my hand. This also would be iniquity deserving of judgment. Paul describes the departure of the Gentile world from the incorruptible God, as he calls him there in Romans 1, and the stages of departure. They fail to give God glory. They fail to give God thanks. They profess themselves to be wise, and then they turn the image of the incorruptible God into the corruptible. Kind of the stages by which that happened, seemingly was that, obviously Noah and his family, they all know God, they all worship God. But as time continues and as humanity presses forward, possibly post-Babel, you find that instead of casting their eyes upon God, they kind of cast their eyes on the next greatest thing. And that's where you have the beginning of the worship of the heavenly bodies. And so the sun, the moon, and the stars. When you see him saying, my mouth has kissed my hand, that's actually one of the literal meanings of worship. One of the words for worship, anyway, in the Bible, literally means to kiss the hand towards. And so it's it's a picture of reverence and worship that is lost in our culture. Obviously, we don't do that when we come into worship, but that's what they did. And he says, I haven't worshipped the sun, moon, and the stars. And so this is probably pre, obviously all of the other forms of idolatry that follow. And I think that that's probably the progression that it took. People began to worship the sun, moon, and stars, and then they began to fashion gods that were more or less, kind of anthropomorphic. They were worshiping gods that were fashioned in their image as opposed to the image of the everlasting God. And so I haven't done any of that, Job says. He also says he hasn't been vindictive. Look how much there's a focus on the heart already, again, here, 2,000 years before Jesus. If I had rejoiced at the destruction of him who hated me, or lifted myself up when evil found him. I still remember the way that people responded when Osama bin Laden was, and I don't know if that name is familiar to everyone, if everybody is aware of, recent history. I know some were kind of young when all that happened, but kind of the mastermind behind the September 11th attacks here in the United States. And but anyway, he was dealt swift justice by the American military and taken out in a night. And there were people, Christian people, who rejoiced at that. We should have no pleasure when the wicked perish, because when the wicked perish, that means they go to eternal hell. And that's not something that we want for anyone or should want for anyone. And we see that heart set all the way back here again in the Old Testament with Job. He says, I have not rejoiced when someone who mistreated me, when they got what was coming to them, and so there can be a sad, a sad thought towards the person who has died. There may be even a statement of gratitude to God who has worked in providential ways to remove an enemy. But to think that someone will be excited that someone has gone to hell is just, and has always been, an ungodly disposition. He says in verses 31 and 32 that he has been hospitable. We saw that kind of earlier when he talked about verse 17, sharing his food. But chapter 31, verse 31, he says, if men of my tent have not said, who is there that has not been satisfied with his meat? So no sojourner had to lodge in the street, for I've opened my doors to the traveler. What we miss in today's culture, by both being highly mobile and by having modern conveniences. Used to be that communities were not as mobile, and where sojourners were fewer, and where they were treated like this. People would actually have strangers into their home and show them hospitality. And today we just take for granted that people will find care some other way. And we just missing something, I think, in today's culture. And if we're not careful, hospitality can really go undone where it's absolutely necessary. 1 Peter chapter 4, I believe it's around verse 9 or thereabouts. Peter says that we need to use hospitality toward one another. And so that's an admonition to us to not let hospitality go undone, especially amongst the people of God. In chapter 31 and verse 33, he didn't hide when he'd done anything wrong. If I've covered my transgression as Adam, so he's aware of Adam, obviously, and he didn't try to hide from God when he'd done something wrong. He acknowledged what he did that was wrong, and repented and sacrificed. He, in fact, lived with nothing to hide. And chapter 31 and verse 34, because I feared the great multitude and dreaded the contempt of families, so that I kept not silence and did not go out of the door. And so I never had to fear being amongst people because I'd done something wrong. So nothing to hide. Now, on the basis of all of that, Job kind of throws down the gauntlet, and he challenges both God and man. And here we are again, Job, ironically saying, I wish that someone would write a book about this. In verse 35, oh, that I had one to hear me. Here is my mark. Oh, that the Almighty would answer me, that my prosecutor had written a book. So who's his prosecutor? Not Satan. He sees it as being God. And he says, I wish all this was just in a book, and if we could write it all down, objective audiences would see it, and I would be right. He says, I would carry it on my shoulder. I would bind it on me like a crown. I would declare to him the number of my steps. I declare to God the number of my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him. Wow. Now, God can elevate man, and does. When Jacob kind of had that wrestling match with the angel, what was the outcome? He gets the name Israel. Israel is very variously interpreted, variously translated and understood. I mean, some people say it means one who has prevailed with God. Some even say, though, that perhaps it means something like a prince of God. And so someone who God sees as being a prince. But to claim that for ourselves, Job has been a blameless man, a great man. But again, we look at these words and we say, there's something a little bit too much in what Job is saying. Job has gone a little bit too far, and righteousness has become a sort of self-righteousness. So he closes out with, and those are key verses that I want you to be aware of. But again, Job has never gotten anything by evil, with yet another claim of his righteousness in verses 38 through 40. So, what are we going to do with that? Well, we've already established that Eliphaz, Zophar, Bildad, they got nothing. They have nothing more to say to Job. But we are now going to find out that there was somebody else who was there, listening all along. A young man by the name of Elihu. So in chapters 32 through 37, we see Elihu speaking. Maybe pause for a second. I should have done this before, but any questions over those first 31 verses? Anything that we've seen in Job, in Job's kind of vigorous defense of himself?
It was a very thorough assessment of his life.
Yeah, I haven't done it yet, but I would love to sometime do a sermon series on chapter 31 and just reflecting on those points regarding his character, because I think there's a lot to learn there. I don't like what Job ultimately does with his self-assessment. I'm going to come to God. As a prince, I'm going to approach him. Well, I don't like that part, but really everything else he says, again, is a description of something that God identified as being blameless. And so that's something I need to learn from. But yeah. Well, chapter 32, let's jump into Elihu. And we'll put on our skates a little bit here with Elihu. But before we get into the speeches, I want to ask the question: what do we make of him? What do we make of Elihu? Commentators are divided on what to make of Elihu. Some see Elihu as being a spokesman for God, like he claims to be. Some see him as just being another friend, another in the long line of Eliphaz, Zophar, and Bildads. He's just the fourth in the rank. And so be aware that is how this text is interpreted. And like much of the book of Job, possibly owing to its antiquity, there is some problematic Hebrew in this section that kind of yields these different interpretations. So having said that, I am not of the opinion that Elihu is yet another in the same vein as the first three friends. The main reason that I am not of that viewpoint, and kind of what colors the way that I view these chapters where Elihu speaks, is he's not condemned by God. So he's not. The other three friends are condemned specifically by God in chapter 42, and Elihu is not. Further, even though like you're reading through what Elihu says, and you're like, that sounds a lot like, you know, variously, either Job or the three friends, and you're like, well, maybe just saying more of the same. And but you're going to see little things that are different in what he says, and actually things that are valuable in what he says if you're looking at it expecting to see that kind of thing. Like if you're looking for it, I think you'll see it. And you'll have to remember as you're reading those other things that there are good things that are said by everyone in this text, by whether it's again Job, Eliphaz, you know, Bildad, Zophar. They're all saying it. Occasionally, things that are right. You know, some more than others, obviously. So again, don't be surprised by seeing some of the same, but look for what's different. And I'm going to suggest that in what's different that you'll see something better than what these three friends have been saying. Whatever the case, I'm going to suggest that Elihu does bring some new light into the discussion and adds a dimension to the discussion that's been lacking. And there's a reason why we have him here. I don't think it's just more of the same at all, which I hold in the lowest value those commentators that would say, you know, it's just more of the same. I think that they're not looking hard enough. So summarizing these speeches you have basically three speeches of Elihu. Both at the end of these three speeches, or the first two, I should say, opportunity is given for others to speak, and no one says anything, so Elihu keeps talking. You find a lengthy apology from Elihu in chapter 32 as it opens up. You know, you kind of get the text introducing Elihu here. He's been sitting around and waiting because he's the young man here. You know, everybody else is older than him. In verse 4, because they were years older than he, Elihu had waited to speak to Job, and so he's been here, but he's been waiting. And he hears the three friends talk in verse 5, and he says, "There's no answer in their mouth, either before or certainly not to what he's most recently said." He's now gotten angry. You know, he's like, I got to say something. And so he does. And so, but he opens up with a very lengthy apology. You know, the Westerner, I was actually, you know, told once, don't apologize for teaching the truth, you know, but there maybe is something to be said about softening someone by conceding where your shortcomings are. And so he identifies himself as someone who's younger, and you know, but in the course of having said that, verse 9, great men are not always wise, nor do the aged always understand justice. So those who are older don't always get it right. Chapter 33, here's his position and his specific appeal to Job. And of course, his appeal is for Job to you know, to turn back to God, but in a different way than the friends have been saying. There's debated translation there in verse number 6 as to what he is claiming at this point. I think there's even a where there's debate, that sometimes that debate is settled by later in the text. I think we've seen that, you know, like, what was Job saying, what we thought he might be saying back in chapter 25. Well, later on he says it basically. Here, you know, verse 6, the New King James has it as, truly I am as your spokesman before God. So is he spokesman before God? Is he someone who is toward God? Is he belonging to God? You know, so what exactly is he claiming here? And again, later on, he's going to make a pretty clear claim that he is speaking for God. The issue is that Job is irreverent. This is different. You know, he's not made up charges. He's saying, Job, you've not shown proper respect. So surely you have spoken in my hearing, and I have heard the sound of your words, saying, I am pure without transgression. I am innocent, and there is no iniquity in me. Now, this is where commentators are like, well, now, wait a second. Job did say that. Job did say that he had sinned. But if you look at what he's just said, he's effectively said, I've done all these good things, and I can come to God, and I'm going to be like a prince to him. You know, I'm going to be someone of regard before him. So, and what, even though this is a summary, this is more or less what Job is saying. I am innocent. and yet he, God, finds occasion against me. He counts me as his enemy, and he has said that. He puts my feet in the stocks and watches all my paths, but always negatively, and he has said that too. He says, look in this you are not righteous. In this you are not righteous, not in made up charges, but in this you are not righteous. I will answer you, for God is greater than man. Why do you contend with him? He does not give an accounting of any of his words. So everybody's been saying that God is great, but what does that actually mean? It should mean to the friends Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar that you don't make up stuff about people and claim that God has told you stuff that he hasn't. And what should it mean to Job? It should mean that even though you might not like what's going on to you right now, don't think you know more than God about what's happening here, and don't think that your case is going to stand up in court against God and win. So you can't contend with God. You can't fight with God. You're not showing in that way God the proper respect. On that basis, we find an attempt to explain providence. So he's trying to get Job to understand in these verses 14 through 30 the way that God is working, and in the way that he's kind of working things out through his providential care, and how he's making things right and punishing those who have done wrong. Speech 2, and you'll notice that speech 1 closes out with verse 31. Give ear, Job, listen to me, hold your peace, and I will speak. If you have anything to say, answer me. Speak, for I desire to justify you. So if not, listen to me. Hold your peace, and I will teach you wisdom. So gives him the opportunity to speak. Job clearly doesn't take that opportunity, and Elihu continues. So chapter 34, another charge of irreverence and another defense of God. And so he's trying to flesh out now. Job has said, I am righteous, but God has taken away my justice. And again, that is what Job has said. It's just not good. Now, again, the commentators step in when he says this, in verse 7, what man is like Job who drinks scorn like water, who goes in company with the workers of iniquity and walks with the wicked? For he has said, it profits a man nothing that he should delight in God. That's where it's statements like that cause Elihu to be treated not favorably by those, who are minded to do so. But why has he said that here? What really is the specific charge that he's made? Well, again, I'm going to suggest that what he's saying here is not that, that Job is just a great sinner, prior to all this happening. He's placing the sinfulness of irreverence in the category of those who drink scorn like water. To be irreverent to God, to not show God proper respect, is its own form of scorn towards God, its own form of sinfulness before God. And so again, that's how I interpret those words. And like I said, there is a variety of interpretation of those kinds of words in Elihu. So ultimate issue, though, getting through the text rather quickly, verses 34 through 37. The ultimate issue is that Job is speaking against the plan and purpose of God. Men of understanding say to me, wise men who listen to me, Job speaks without knowledge. His words are without wisdom. Oh, that Job were tried to the uttermost, because his answers are like those of wicked men. That's the issue. And again, I don't see him saying the same thing, even though he's now charging Job with having done it wrong. It's not the same kind of wrong. So he adds a rebellion to his sin. He claps his hand among us and multiplies his words against God. So in chapter 35, he states that this irreverence effectively is presumptuous, and he appeals a cry to God with a different attitude. Sorry for the lowercase g there. I want to fix that.
I was just making a note to mention that to you afterwards.
Oh yeah. Talking about being irreverent before God, I'm not capitalizing God, so sorry about that. Although it's interesting, the trend in both translation and academia of not capitalizing pronouns and words in reference to deity. It's just, and I'm like, when I got that kind of guideline on the master's level, I was like, nope. you can forget that. I'm gonna keep capitalizing pronouns in reference to deity. Although that does confuse me from time to time, and God will have to I'll have to ask God's forgiveness for that one, because sometimes when I'm writing, it's like, which is the he that I'm talking about? I'm make that mistake every now and then. But anyway, try to show respect to God in the ways that I know how. Verses 9 through 13. This is how Elihu thinks a sufferer should pray and why he should pray. So I find that to be useful to our discussion. Verse number 9, because of the multitude of oppressions they cry out for help because of the arm of the mighty, but no one says, where is God my maker, who gives songs in the night, who teaches us more than the beasts of the earth and makes us wiser than the birds of heaven? There's always something about God to delight in. And again, trying to view Elihu as a positive and a different message here, that's something that people have been missing in this discussion up until this point. That even in this dark moment, that there is something useful, or that there is something to be happy about as relates to God. There they cry out, verse 12, but he does not answer because of the pride of evil men. It's prideful to not realize that there is value in God, and that God has done something beautiful in your life. Songs in the night. Again, think about that next time you're going through something. There's a reason why we count our blessings, so that we can understand and put into context what it is that we are enduring. Closes out again accuses Job. It says, verse 16, therefore Job opens his mouth in vain. He multiplies words without knowledge. Again, before you simply dismiss Elihu as just another one of the friends, compare that with chapter 38 and verse 2. This is God speaking. Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Well, it's the same thing, right? So again, that's how we're viewing Elihu. But chapter 36, it begins by saying Elihu also proceeded. There must have been a pause, no response. Elihu keeps talking. And you find that there's a little bit of a change of tactics here. Instead of defending God, he's going to talk about manifesting a true and a total respect for God, something that's missing in everybody up to this point. It's missing in Job because he doubts God because of his problems. It's also missing in the friends who've been blinded to reality by their self-righteousness, and they are convinced of sin because they are convinced of their knowledge, and have taken Job's downfall as a means of elevating themselves in their own eyes. So, what does total respect for God look like? Chapter 36, this is again that clearer claim that he is speaking for God. Chapter 36, he says in verse 2, there are yet words to speak on God's behalf. So that's a more clear statement that he's speaking for God. After claiming to speak for God, he states that God, that God does what is right, and that Job should yield to him. And so God is mighty; he despises no one. Verse 5, does not preserve the life of the wicked, gives justice to the oppressed. He does what's right in the right time, and Job ultimately, he says, should yield before God. In verses 8 through 11, again, a little nuance in what he's saying here. If they're bound in fetters, held in the cords of affliction, then he tells them their work and their transgressions, that they have acted defiantly. He also opens their ear to instruction and commands that they turn from iniquity. So whom the Lord loves, what does he do? According to the Hebrews author. And also according to wisdom literature. That's a quotation.
Sorry, what was the question?
Whom the Lord loves, he does what? According to Hebrews 12.
He disciplines.
He disciplines or chastens, right?
Yeah.
So the Lord, and that's what effectively Elihu's describing here. He's describing how providence works, chastening, and so God is forming people and reforming people by means of suffering at times. He continues to appeal to Job in chapter 37 to recognize God's works, and ultimately is paving the way for God to speak. He starts talking about God's majesty through his through the things he's created, in particular weather. And you almost get the sense, because chapter 38 says that the Lord answers Job out of a whirlwind. As you're reading chapter 37, you kind of get the sense that he's actually describing an approaching storm. He says, hear attentively the thunder of his voice. Maybe he's hearing the actual thunder at that point. He thunders with his voice, verse 4. Thunders marvelously with his voice, verse 5. So maybe these are, the thunder is coming, the rain is starting to fall, and he's using this as a way of describing the glory, the power, the majesty of God. And consider the wondrous works of God. Listen to this, Job. Consider the wondrous works of God, verse 14. So, and with God is awesome majesty, total respect in what Elihu is saying for God and his position. So that's Elihu. Any questions over what we've seen in Elihu, or anything that maybe you've seen in your reading? Comments even? I hate that I'm not pausing to ask as many questions. We are moving rather quickly through the text, and in the aim of trying to complete Job as we're tasked with doing tonight. But feel free to continue the conversation elsewhere or over email. We'll get into chapter 38 through 41 and finally get to God, and God now coming in and speaking. Job wants his court case. God, rather through Elihu's words, we've seen God doesn't need to go into court with anybody. He has a purpose, and that purpose ought to be respected. And having said that, you find that when God speaks, with Elihu having said that, when God ultimately speaks, there's no defense of himself. He doesn't need to defend himself, and all there is for the questioner Job is there are a series of questions, and the questions are designed to show Job not his inadequacy as much as what he doesn't know. And with the realization, therefore, that what he doesn't know, God does know. So we are just going to paint these questions with very, very broad strokes. First of all, the introduction in the first three verses, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? He's not talking about Elihu, because he says, now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you and you shall answer me. Who is he talking to? What man is he talking to? Well, in chapter 40, moreover, the Lord answered Job, verse 1. So he's talking to Job. He's not talking to Elihu, not talking to Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar. He's talking to Job. And so Job has darkened counsel, has hidden wisdom by saying things that are not correct. And so I'm going to question you, God says, and you'll answer me. So what does he ask Job about? Well, first of all, he says, let me tell you about how I care for the world. And so for the care for the inanimate world is mostly the topic of chapter 38. You might accuse whatever medieval monk it was that was dividing up the Bible into chapters and verses of having messed up at the close of the chapter when you see God talking about lions and ravens and verses 39 through 41. But really what he's describing in verses 30 and 39 through 41 is still an aspect of the inanimate world. He's describing the cycle of life, or not maybe an aspect of the inanimate world, but an aspect of kind of the overall world, so the circle of life, to borrow from the Lion King, is what he's describing in verses 39 through 41. And so God's care for the inanimate world, many questions designed to help him to see that it is he, God, who has created the world, created the most important features of the world. And so then he asks questions about God's care for the animate world, both in terms of the wild animals in the first several sets of animals, but also in terms of the domesticated animals like the horse in verse 19. And so there's the question, and if you're having a question with an evolutionist, you can bring up some of this stuff, right? Because like the ostrich in verse 13, the wings of the ostrich wave proudly, but are her wings and pinions like the kindly storks? So the ostrich waves its wings, but it can't fly. And what's more, it says she leaves her eggs on the ground and warms them in the dust, but then she forgets that a foot may crush them or a wild beast may break them. So that what evolutionary advantage is there of having a big old bird that can't fly and puts its eggs in the ground where they can be stepped on? Well, there's none. So why does the ostrich exist? Because God made it that way. And there's so many animals that are like that. I mean, where if you really sat down and considered why this animal is made the way it is, you would not be drawn to natural selection. You'd be drawn to, well, God must have thought it would be interesting for us. So he just made the ostrich so that we could, go, oh, that's a funny animal. And that's basically it. It is God, it says, who deprived her of wisdom, verse 17, did not endow her with understanding, so on. So God made animals as he wished and for our benefit. Chapter 40, Job is allowed to speak, and already he kind of gets it, but God says, let me make sure you got it. And chapter 40, we're going to hone in on these first 14 verses as verses of importance. So verse 2, shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? He who rebukes God, let him answer. So you have effectively rebuked me, is how God views this. Keep that in mind. I've taught the book of Job a couple of times in congregational settings and found people debate me on Job having done something wrong. And, you just get here and you're like, well, how can you even argue that point? Job has rebuked God. He's called God an enemy, and he's effectively said, I'm right and you're wrong. Well, God says, I've noticed that. What do you have to say for yourself? And this is what Job says in verse number 4, behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. He talked about how people put their hand over their mouths when they saw Job coming because of his status. But now he sees his own status before God. He says, once I've spoken, but I will not answer, twice, but I will proceed no further. I've said too much effectively, and I won't say anything more. But God's not done. And so he says, I want you to think about yourself in relation to me. And so for me, some of the most powerful questions that God asks are here in verses 6 through 14. So he says, now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you and you shall answer me. When you indeed annul my judgment, would you condemn me that you may be justified? Would you say I'm wrong and you're right? Have you an arm like God? Why does he ask that question, do you think? This is a good place to get a little discussion here, where we haven't had much this evening. Why do you think he asks that question? He says, have you an arm like God, after saying, would you annul my judgment? Would you condemn me? Not everyone wants now.
I mean, an
Like,
arm like God, that use of arm or hand is often used to represent, the strength, the power, the influence of an individual. The hand of the king reaches out and strikes his enemies and whatnot. So we go from, would you indeed annul my justice? Would you declare me guilty so that you may be right? Right? Is that Job has functionally declared himself righteous over God, right? That
Yep.
Job is more righteous than God, that he is
Yep.
in some way, shape, or fashion better than God. That if I were God, I would have made different decisions, and therefore I'm a better decision maker than God, right? Something we often hear comes up in the whole problem of suffering thing, right? Is that the accusation of the problem of suffering is, well, I don't think things are run very well, which means if I was running things, if I was God, I would run them better. And the gods, pushing back on that, kind of underlining that for Job, like, were you seriously saying this? Do you understand the ramifications of this? Do you
Yep.
see where you're standing, what your limitations are, who and what you are in relation to me, to God, right? Like, think seriously about the implications you're making when you challenge me to a court battle, essentially.
Maybe to summarize, when we cast judgment on God, here's what I'm really asking: what position do we put ourselves in? How do we see ourselves? Maybe without even acknowledging it. Usually, in fact, almost always without acknowledging it.
Better than,
and effectively, therefore, God. To cast judgment upon an omnipotent, omniscient, being, an all-knowing divine being, to cast judgment on such a being is to declare myself as God. And so Job, he's asking, how strong is your arm? You've made a pretty big claim here. You've put yourself in the judgment seat over me effectively. So you've declared yourself as God, but how strong are you? And so the heart of this entire set of questions of God to Job is helping Job to realize not just that God is worthy of respect, but he alone is worthy of absolute respect. Like he occupies a unique and in unassailable position, a position that no man or no person, no created thing can possibly get to. And on that basis alone, we have to be okay with things like suffering and death and all of that, because he's in the position to determine these things. And the thing we can be thankful with the story of the Bible is that we get a sense not just that God is great and therefore we have to be okay with it, but God actually knows what he's doing. That the story of Revelation is a story of us being given reason to trust in God. Someone was troubled as they were thinking and evaluating their relationship with God recently. They felt as though they were kind of losing sight of the heart of God, as they said. And I said, well, just as you're reading the Bible, just kind of pause and ask yourself, what am I learning about God here? We can very quickly allow ourselves to be backed in a corner by the atheists. People like Richard Dawkins that portray God as this malevolent bully, he called him. He actually had this long string of things that he said, negative epithets for God. And, you can find yourself backed into a corner when people talk about, the ethnic cleansing of the promised land, or when they talk about the reality of a global flood. But let's take that one, for example, the global flood. I mean, how do we see God up until that point? What does the Bible declare about God up until that point? It shows a God of immense patience and grace, doesn't it? The text does it. You see God saying, in the day that Adam and Eve eat of the tree, they will die. But they don't. And as New Testament audiences, we know how that works. they don't die because on that day, Jesus effectively took their place. The first Adam brought sin and death, but the second Adam, there's purpose in him being called that in Romans 5. The second Adam takes the place of the first Adam, and of all of those who choose sin thereafter, that will then go on to place their faith in God. So the story continues, and you've got Cain, and you've got Cain murdering his brother and not even feeling sorry about it. But because this is the first case of murder, and because God is again being abundantly and overly gracious, he doesn't kill Cain. He doesn't. Later on, that's going to be the Noahic, sort of law going forward, is that the person who sheds blood, by man shall his blood be shed, Genesis 9 onward. But at this point, he allows Cain to live, and not even just to live, but he becomes sort of this prosperous individual. He builds a city, and he has a successful lineage that comes from him, metal workers, musicians, and so you look at this story of God just being abundantly patient. And when you actually come to chapter 6 and you see him not being patient anymore, instead of saying, oh, God's just a big bully up there in the sky and waiting to punish people and that kind of thing that the atheists picture him as, you start to see him as someone who really is not that at all. And how bad must it have been, and what would have been the consequence had he not? As you start to look at it differently, right? And that's what the Bible is designed to do. It's designed to help us to see again that God is trustworthy, and actually he does what he can to work for us. Job says, God is against me. Paul says, God is for us. And if God is for us, who can be against us? So I wanted to highlight that and call us to think about that, because I think that's the heart of the discussion here. Now, I will say about chapter 40 and chapter 41, you have two creatures identified here, Behemoth and Leviathan. I have seen like a couple of the kids' books that we've gotten for our boys try to identify this as like a hippo and an alligator, and I'm like, no. you read these and they do not line up with any creature living, but that doesn't mean they don't line up with any creature ever conceived of, or ever that has been ever been a part of reality. I'm a firm believer that Behemoth and Leviathan are dinosaurs. I hope I didn't lose credibility in the minds of some in saying that, but I mean, you read these descriptions, and I think it's inescapable. Behemoth is probably akin to something like a brontosaurus or brachiosaurus, one of these giant lumbering long-necked creatures. You just can't identify him with people say it's like it's an elephant or a hippo, but it describes his tail, this massive tail, and it's like that just doesn't line up, with any creature that we have on a similar size and scale, or even try to elevate to a similar size and scale. Leviathan, you say, we've got a creature here who can breathe fire. Well, we've got a beetle called the bombardier beetle that can shoot out a scalding, I don't know the Celsius, but over 400 Fahrenheit, kind of puff of chemical cloud onto those things that are trying to attack it. So it shouldn't surprise us that creation has a few tricks up its sleeve, so to speak. Even though we haven't seen a fire-breathing reptile, we've seen an electric eel, we've seen a bombardier beetle. We shouldn't question that such creatures could have existed. So anyway, chapter 42, as the book comes to a close, and our study for tonight therefore does the same. We see Job confessing his wrongs, as we said that he would. Chapter 42, verse 2, I know you can do everything. No purpose of yours can be withheld from you. Now realize you are who maybe I've claimed you are, but I didn't really embrace the reality of it. Verse 3, you asked, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? Me. Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand. Things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Listen, please, and let me speak. That's kind of him saying, what he was saying before. I will question you, and you shall answer me. But now he says, I've heard of you by the hearing of the ear. Now my eye sees you, and I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. And so what is he repenting of? Not of sin prior to his suffering, not of losing sight of his faith during his suffering, but of the lack of reverence, the lack of respect that he has shown in his suffering for God. He confesses his wrongs, and then now the Lord continues and says specifically to Eliphaz the Temanite, my wrath is aroused against you. So remember, we were writing there, therefore identifying him as kind of the leader here. But notice it says, and your two friends. So not your three friends, but your two friends. And so the ultimate kind of a sort of punishment of humility for Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar is that they now have to go to my servant Job. That's what God is saying about Job. And he is going to pray for you, and I'll accept him. And if you don't do that, if you don't go to Job and ask him to pray for you, then I will deal with you according to your folly, because you have spoken of me what is not right, as my servant Job has. So Job has said more right than what these three friends have said. We see there were issues in what Job said, and we've identified those, and Job has repented of those. And of course, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar did just that, thankfully, and they were restored when Job prayed for them. And when that happened, also in verses 10 and following, the Lord also restored Job's losses. We see him effectively, if you compare this with the list back in chapter 1, he's getting twice as much as before, but he's getting only 10 more children. And that reminds us of the fact that effectively his number of children have doubled, whereas our marriages don't continue into the hereafter. The fact that we are someone's children does, and so his children remain his children even though they've departed, and he has merely 10 more. And so we find in the course of that, not only there are 10 children, but 3 very beautiful daughters, names that highlight sort of a return to joy. You might wonder, why are the 3 beautiful daughters of Job referenced here in verse 14? If you look at the meaning of those names, which again, there's a little bit of problem trying to interpret names, but they're very beautiful, joyous, kind of happy names, and so I think that's what that's about. That Job's not just returning to prosperity, but he's returning to joy. And he dies in verse 17, old and full of days. What questions do we have over the book of Job?
Not questions, but I think your references in your last slide should be chapter 42.
You're right.
Because I keep looking at the verse, I keep going wrong.
Yep, good job. So I repent. And let's go ahead and fix the ending there. There we go. Iron sharpens iron.
So am I right to say, in effect, God never did explain to Job why he was tested? No,
there is no response, and effectively no response needed. The implication is that when you have embraced God in faith, you leave that to God. You know, you accept what he does because you understand who he is. And what I've said, you know, for us as New Testament students of all of this, we've seen enough to know that God is trustworthy. We've seen enough to know, you know, God doesn't have to keep proving himself. We do things as human beings. We get into situations, we give God ultimatums, and you know, if you'll do this, I'll do this, and really, you know, we should say, you know, God has done enough. God has done enough to prove himself. And I should simply just trust him in this position to do, you know, what is best. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't express our desires in prayer. That's what God expects us to do, to cast our cares upon him. But you know, at the end of the day, when the answer is given and it's not what we want, then we have to trust that it's what's best. And we have to also trust that it's not just what's best for us, but it's what's eternally best for his story of redemption, of which I am a very, very, very small part. You know, it's not all about me. Satan would have us being the center of our own universe, but the Christian has God at the center of his universe. Okay. Well,
Sorry, my phone died.
yeah, no, that's okay. Yeah, I see you coming in here as Momoko, so
Yeah.
I'm guessing that's not your name. But no, I'm glad you got to come back. But we are just about to wrap up for the evening, and looking at the time, I can see that we've gone a little bit for overtime, and I appreciate your patience with that. We are going to be leaving the book of Job behind for this next upcoming class. We're going to pick up with the book of Ecclesiastes. And so we have shorter scope of study for the next couple of weeks going forward, but don't let that fool you. The book of Ecclesiastes is a challenging book. But as you're reading it and preparing for class next time, what I want you to do is to take note of the phrase "under the sun," under the sun. And we're going to talk about the significance of the statements that are made under the sun, as opposed to some statements that come later in the book. And so I'm excited about getting into that book with you. Let's go ahead and close out with a word of prayer. Most holy God, we praise you and thank you for the time that we've been able to spend reflecting upon your majesty, your glory, through the teaching of the book of Job. Father, we have seen your greatness on display in this book, and we have been called to remember at this time, so that we can remember in worse times, that when bad things happen, you are still God. Help us to hold on to our faith and not merely our integrity in those moments of trial. Help us to embrace you and trust in whatever you give us, or whatever you withhold from us or allow to be withheld from us. We pray, Father, that you will help us to learn from the positive lessons of the book that are on display throughout, and that you'll help us to learn from those times when the people involved said or did things that were wrong. We thank you, Father, for this time we've been able to spend together. We pray you'll bless the weeks that we have ahead of us, and we offer this in Jesus' holy name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Patrick, the midterm exam, is that up to the end of Job?
No, it's not. It is only, I'm glad you asked that, it's only Psalms and Proverbs. So the material for Job is all going to be material that you will encounter on the final, and the final will not be cumulative, just to go ahead and also say that. So we're effectively saying midterm, Proverbs and Psalms, final, Job, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And we are going to be engaging Song of Solomon through a video, and we'll try to, it'll probably be within the, I hate making predictions because I've not been very good at doing that this term, but I'm going to try within the next 2 weeks to get that to you. And I think we have 3 weeks of class left ahead of us, and we'll use all of those to take us through the book of Ecclesiastes. So, all right. Thanks for the question.
All right.